Revelation 2898. From the 26th of September 1943. Intellectual freedom. New doctrine in coercion. Only complete spiritual freedom can guarantee higher development, whereas spiritual bondage has extremely serious consequences. And therefore the human being must try to free himself from the control of those who want to make him spiritually unfree insofar as they want to impart a thought system to him and force him to accept it. Every teaching which is put into a form and which is, so to speak, made obligatory for people, is a spiritual bondage of which there cannot be enough warning. People's thinking is unlawfully forced into a path that need not lead upwards, and the acceptance of teachings is made dependent on punishment or reward. The human being should be able to decide about himself completely freely. He should be introduced to Christ's teaching of love, but then be left complete freedom as to how he wants to relate to this teaching of love. Only then can it take effect as Jesus Christ taught. That the human being recognizes it as divine teaching by the promises and their fulfillment, as soon as he makes an effort to follow them. But if the fulfillment of the divine will is made his duty, he will never feel the blessing of the promises. He certainly lives in accordance with the commandments, however, he is not driven to do so from within. Instead, his actions and thoughts are brought up and therefore do not bring about the spiritual progress which he should consciously strive for. The human being must be completely independent and be able to develop freely both upwards and downwards. He must not be prevented from doing evil, just as he should not be driven to do good either, for he should freely decide for himself for good or evil. He should develop all good abilities in himself of his own accord and seek to fight the bad in himself. Then he will live in spiritual freedom and his upward development will no longer be endangered. But wanting to impose a spiritual direction on a fellow human being, wanting to determine him to adhere to it, is a great danger for the soul insofar as it then allows itself to be driven and does not take a mental stand on it itself. It then certainly fulfills what is made its duty, but it constantly finds itself in a spiritual bondage, in a relationship of bondage to those who want to transfer its thinking to others. And such spiritual bondage will be striven for. People will be offered a teaching and, as it were, compulsorily demanded to profess this teaching, and only a few will resist and defend their spiritual freedom. Only a few will recognize it as the work of God's adversary and not allow themselves to be determined, and this refusal will initiate the battle of faith, and the freedom of faith will be infringed upon. The human being will constantly live in danger of being treated as an outsider and adversary who wants to preserve his spiritual freedom and believes himself entitled to make his own decision in matters of faith. And thus those who refuse to accept thought material which is intended to contribute to people's ennoblement but which leads people astray will be regarded as enemies. For truth can only be gained through free, uninfluenced thinking which is turned towards God alone. But it can never be the result of thinking which is forcibly guided onto a certain path, because truth has to come from within, whereas that thinking is supplied to the human being from outside. For even divine truth, which the human being hears through the inner voice, has to be recognized by his fellow human being as truth again from within, even if it is offered to him as a teaching. He must also deal with these teachings himself in fullest freedom of will before it is recognized by him as truth, before his heart informs him of it. Spiritual freedom is always the condition for spiritual progress, whereas spiritual coercion leaves the human being's soul unimpressed and only controls the intellect. Thus the human being is forced to think in a certain direction which people consider good and favorable for their plans. And it cannot be warned enough against giving up spiritual freedom. The human being should determine himself without any external influence, because this alone is decisive for his higher development, and any coercion means a standstill or decline. Amen.